Well, friends, we finally made it. We finally made it to the one that doubtlessly anybody watching this who has any interest in Dorian Gray was probably looking forward to me talking about the most when I started this series. The 1945 Albert Lewin film starring Hurd Hatfield and George Sanders. This is the version with the fantastic Henrique Medina painting of Dorian as a young man, and the unbelievable painting by Ivan Lee Lorraine Albright as Dorian the old man. This is a film that, beyond any other version of Dorian Gray, has gone down as the definitive version. Now, we have talked about some other versions that I feel were closer to the book, some versions that were more accurate, some versions that made changes that were better than the changes made in this film, but this film, beyond any, will always be the definitive Dorian Gray, just because it is probably, well, no, not even probably, it is doubtlessly the most masterfully made of the films. And as far as adapting the source material directly from book to film, with minimal changes, it probably is the best written as well. This film was released in 1945, and it was actually so well received, and Hurd Hatfield's performance as Dorian Gray was so chilling to the audiences of the time that poor Hurd Hatfield was typecast for the rest of his life and actually struggled as an actor because his performance as the cad Dorian Gray was just too good. People could not buy him as a handsome leading man anymore, and so he was never really in that much after this, at least not in terms of things this big. George Sanders is a great actor, and I've seen him in a lot of things. Most notably, I think one of his best performances was in the Hitchcock production of Rebecca. George Sanders was like, he was like the Jeff Goldblum of his day. You didn't cast George Sanders to play some character, you cast George Sanders because he was really good at being George Sanders. We're going to get into kind of a point-by-point going through the whole movie here in just a minute, but I do want to just go ahead and acknowledge some of the big changes. Probably the biggest is that the character Hattie, the country girl that Dorian falls in love with, who is just kind of a nobody, she shows up in dialogue in one chapter of the book, and she's instrumental to Dorian's final act. However, we never see or interact with her. We don't know anything about her. She's as useless to us as she is to Dorian, and I think that's kind of the idea. So instead, to give us a character we cared more about, Hattie is replaced with a character named Gladys, who is Basil Hallward, the painter's niece, who he, I guess, adopts. There's not a whole lot of background behind why they're together, but it seems that he adopted her, and as a child she has a crush on Dorian, which Dorian thinks is kind of cute, and as he realizes his youth is fading away from him, he is kind of sad when she's like, "You'll stay just as you are until I'm grown, won't you, Dorian?" And that's how, I don't know why she talks like that, but that's how she says the line. And he's like, "Of course I will, sweetheart." And he looks very sad because he realizes, by the time she's grown, not because he actually wants to be with her, but because he realizes that by the time she's grown, that's all the time he has. The childhood of one kid before he becomes an ugly old man. So that's a very, very good, I think, way of changing this character up so that when we see her as an adult, we know her, we like her, we sympathize with her, and we know that Dorian could ruin her, and introducing her to us as an innocent child is a good way of enticing us to be very much on the side of, man, Dorian just needs to keep his distance from this person. They also use her character as a great motivation for Dorian to stab Basil. It gives him even more motivation to do so than in the book, because as Basil's looking on the degradation of the painting, he says, "If only Gladys could see this, what would she think?" And as a result of that, Dorian feels trapped with the knowledge that he's given Basil and realizes there's only one way out. Stab, 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 dead. That's probably the biggest change. Although there are some little changes throughout, beyond that, the majority of it is exact. There's also a great framing device, I think, which was used in the 1960s TV version that we talked about with George C. Scott, right down to using the same narrator, Cedric Hardwicke. It's basically the idea of framing this with a third-person narrator talking about it. The reason I like that is because, now some people would say there's a lot of the actors just standing around emoting while the narrator talks to fill up time. And to be sure, I can understand that criticism, but to me, by keeping it in the format of a story being told, it gives the vibe that everything that is happening is fated to happen. It couldn't happen any other way. And because we're being told the story from the future, after the story has already happened, there's no changing the events. And I feel like that really works with the ideas that the book was trying to get across. It would have been difficult to get across those ideas in any other way. In the opening scene, we get George Sanders sitting in a carriage, and there's a fantastic projector screen behind him, which is showing the carriage moving throughout, and the angle is kind of off. Now, normally that would be a complaint, but there's something about the angle being off and the extremity of the way it's off that really reminds me of some of the shots in Citizen Kane that do the same thing, where the angle is deliberately off to give an artistic impression. It's more about creating a really vibrant image that's going to stick with you, rather than a logical image that would make sense in the real world. So we can see the shadow of the cab driver up ahead, we see the feet of the people moving by, the sidewalk, and of course, Lord Henry in the foreground, and look at what he's holding! The little yellow book, which eventually, in this version, he does give to Dorian. This is the only version I've ever seen that kept the book! What am I talking about? For those of you who haven't read it, Dorian Gray gets a book from Lord Henry, which is called The Little Yellow Book. It's bound in yellow paper, which is indicative that it is a piece of French literature, which is about a hedonistic hero that Dorian basically treats as his Jesus, his person that he wants to emulate. And he has this book bound in multiple colors. Now, that doesn't happen in this version because it's black and white, but he does get the book. And that book is a huge part of what leads to the destruction of Dorian's soul. So, wow! 3 cheers for this movie for doing something that I've never seen any other version do. Once Lord Henry arrives, he and Basil have their conversation, and we can already see the layers. This director, Albert Lewin, he didn't really have that much success. He didn't go on to a great number of things, but I think that's a real shame because when you see this movie, you can tell this man was freaking brilliant. The way he uses the space, there's height differences in the sets. He uses levels so that the camera's up and at a little bit of an angle, so somebody's in the foreground and somebody's in the background, and the leading lines of the floor make you look in this direction. When they go out to talk in the garden, they're sitting in a garden and it's kind of an alleyway between a fence and the wall, and in the back there's Gladys's caretaker who's knitting or something in the background, and they're talking, and there's all these layers and facets, and there's a lot of deep focus in this film, which a lot of people, they think of deep focus, and again, they think of Citizen Kane, and no doubt I do too. Citizen Kane really did popularize that technique. But this movie doesn't get a lot of credit for exactly how deep and rich the images are. In fact, funny enough, every frame of this film is like a painting. Dorian shows up at the house, and get this, another thing that almost no versions incorporate. When they first meet Dorian, he's playing the piano. Dorian and Basil and Harry's dialogue is much the same as from the book in this part, so I'm not going to focus on a lot of it. What I do want to talk about is the visuals, because the visuals are just stellar. Lord Henry sit around delivering the same dialogue that we've heard in every other production that you've ever seen. In this version, Lord Henry is catching and preserving a butterfly. Okay, I understand that by today's standards, some of you might think that's too on the nose. But let's really look at the other versions we've talked about. Lord Henry's always just sitting around, looking bored, while he delivers these lines. And in this version, he is physically doing what his dialogue is doing. I don't care if it's a metaphor that's been used over and over again. If you are telling a visual story, tell a visual story. We can take it. Okay, if you want to tell us this, show us the same things that we've seen in some other movies, fine. But don't let us just sit around being bored. This is a visual medium, not a verbal medium. As Lord Henry catches the butterfly, which is spectacularly fake looking, but as I've said repeatedly, With CGI, it never tends to age as well, although I don't have the same hatred for CG as some people do. But when practical effects look bad, there's something kind of endearing and cute about it, because you get the impression they tried their best, and that's all they could do, and so you're kind of like, I can't help but give you a pass. Dorian's painting is complete, and of course we meet Gladys, the young, I guess she's like 5 years old, who comes in, talks about how she's in love with Dorian. She signs the painting with her Uncle Basil. That's important for later. We get a great little moment of humanization for Lord Henry when Gladys hugs Dorian goodbye and won't hug Lord Henry. And he's like, my goodness, I'll be the laughingstock of every drawing room in London if this gets out. Which is a really cute little moment, and it shows that Lord Henry, for his ridiculously demoralizing philosophies and the words that he uses, is still a human, and that, he does care about these people. He's just what Basil says. He's a good man who is ashamed of what a good man he is. The painting is turned around so that Dorian can see it, and now we get one of the only things that I could class as a gimmick in the movie, and yet I really like it. I can't complain about it, because although, yes, it is a gimmick, it's a really damn good gimmick. The rest of the film is shot in crisp, gorgeous 1945 black and white, the only black and white that should be allowed by law. And when that painting turns around, suddenly the film, for just one shot, reverts to vibrant Technicolor. This emphasizes the importance of the painting, and it sort of draws attention to that this moment, the painting has been given life. When Dorian makes his proclamation that he would give anything, he would give his soul for the painting to age in his stead, the painting comes to life, and the color photography gets that across perfectly. Now, I should mention briefly, although it really doesn't play into the plot, and it's really not important, there is a cat statue, and when Dorian makes his wish, Lord Henry just, out of the blue, goes, Dorian, you should be careful making wishes like that. That is one of the 72 gods of ancient Egypt. It's a relic that Basil brought home from Egypt, and, it's quite capable of granting your wishes. And it's like, okay, George Sanders deserved an Oscar for getting that mouthful of exposition out and making it sound natural. However, there was not really a reason, to my mind, why you needed to give something that could grant the wish. I feel like it's more powerful if it's just kind of left up to the imagination. Especially because if you're going to tell this as a morality tale, then just let it be God, the devil, somebody. I don't know. Dorian goes and starts frequenting the East End, just as he does in the book. He starts hanging around in bad company, and along his journey, he happens into a bar. Now, as he's going into this bar, he is followed by a man with a huge sign on his chest that has a massive eyeball. And it follows him right up to the door of the bar, and once he's in the bar, the door shuts, and there is a window in the bar door, and the guy with the eye walks into position, and that eye is just staring through the window directly into our souls and into Dorian. And I've always really liked that, because it's not drawn a lot of attention to except for that window. It just gets across the idea as though God is watching Dorian, or perhaps, again, adds another little element of fate to all of this. As if it was all determined. It was all the power of some greater power that is watching these events. So in the bar, he sees a singer. Her name is Sybil Vane. That's right, Sybil is not an actress in this. She is a singer. And in this version, she is played by Angela Lansbury, who, Angela Lansbury was like the first love of my life. I don't know what this says about me, but as a child, I just fell in love with Angela Lansbury. And even watching her in things like Murder, She Wrote, where she was older, I have always just been in love with Angela Lansbury. And this was one of her earliest films. I think she was 18 or 19 when this film was made. And she just knocks it out of the park. She is easily the best Sybil Vane. Now, I know she's not very close to the book in the way she's written, but she gets across that air of innocence more so than almost anybody else that I've ever seen play the role. There have been some others that I mentioned that I love, but Angela is just perfect. I also really love how, as Sybil walks around singing, the main guy, the MC of this place, is taking handfuls of fake snow and just dumping it on her head. Wham, wham, wham. I love it. I love it so much. Dorian meets her after a performance, and this is when we meet James Vane, and I think that this introduction to James is better than the others, and it's certainly far more cinematic. There's very little in the way of dialogue in the whole scene. Sybil's mother, who is cast to perfection. I mean, this woman looks just like she should be Angela Lansbury's mom. Sybil's mom, is watching with James into the stage and into this saloon as Dorian plays the accompaniment and Sybil sings a private performance for him of the song. The song Sybil plays, the song which is played recurrently throughout the film, is called Little Yellow Bird, and it is about a little yellow bird who is in a cage, and one of the key lines is that she would rather be out there free than in a cage of gold. James tells Sybil that he will kill Dorian if anything happens to her, and she's like, don't be foolish, and he's like, you don't even know her name, and she goes, of course I do, and she goes up to a picture of a knight in shining armor. The knight in shining armor is important in this version because it is the symbol of Dorian's true self. She goes up to the knight and she says, his name is Sir Tristan, and he is a chivalrous knight like the knights of old, bound to protect women and the good in people. So, that is her idea of him, the knight in shining armor, and that is who Dorian truly, on the deepest level, is and who he's meant to be. Now, I like that because it sets up a redemption arc for Dorian. We want to see him become the person that Sybil thought he was. In this version, Harry, Basil, and Dorian go to see Sybil, and it's a tremendous success. Her singing is fantastic. And they're all very happy. And Basil says, I wasn't sure about this girl at first, but you know what, Dorian, I think she's a perfect match for you. And Harry, in this version, goes, you know what, I agree with Basil. I think she's a good match for you. However, I think she likes you so much, I don't think you need to marry her. And the first time I saw this, watching it, knowing it's a 1945 film, my jaw dropped at the following dialogue. Because I was pretty shocked that after the Hays censorship code, they were able to put these lines in the film. Harry outright says, you should take her home, ask her to stay with you, beg her to stay with you, and then, when she won't, if she won't, sleep with you, kick her out. And then the next day, beg her apologies and be like, oh, you know what, you turned out to be as good as gold. I was just testing you. But if she does sleep with you, then she's not as good as you think, and, you can just use her and throw her away when you're done with her. Now, I'm by all means, I'm paraphrasing, but the idea is so clear in the dialogue, you can't mistake it. I particularly love this moment where after Henry's little speech about his purity test, he just looks at Harry for a moment and says, Harry, I used to think you were a good guy who was ashamed of his virtues. Now I realize you're just an outright cad. But Harry makes a passing remark in order to get Sybil interested in going to Dorian's house. He knows that once Sybil is in that house, Dorian will not be able to help himself but to go through with it. And he does. He does his little purity test, and Sybil Vane leaves his house. And he's kind of happy. He's like, yeah, for once, Harry, I was right. I was right. Sybil is as good as gold. But then it turns out Sybil comes back in. She's so in love with him, so scared of losing him, that she's willing to have sex with him if it means that he will stick around. The next day, we get possibly one of the cruelest things Dorian has done in any movie version. And I think by far, if you want to get the idea of cruelty across, this is way more cruel than what he does to Sybil in the book. After sleeping with her, he sends her a letter the next day, saying, it was all a test, and you failed. Sorry that I took your virginity, however, now I know that you're just a whore, and I've decided that since love is all an illusion, I'm going to live my life entirely for pleasure and become a complete hedonist. And if that leads to the destruction of my soul, then it's your fault. You weren't as good as I thought you were. And by the way, here's some money for, I know you probably feel a little, tore up about it or used, but I think this will compensate you. I've rarely seen, beyond the implication of Dorian being a pedophile in that other one, You rarely see Dorian do something this cruel. It's kind of hard to get creative with the things Dorian can do beyond what has already been done in these films. And this, whoo, good gracious. Yeah, yikes. What I really love is when Dorian sees his painting for the first time. The painting's scowl is very noticeable. And there's something just kind of uncanny about that first change in the painting. The painting no longer looks beautiful. There's something very off about it. I think it's even the angle of the head has changed a little bit. It's just unsettling. I really don't like to look at it, to tell you the truth. Where the camera kind of tilts down as Dorian realizes where he's going to put the painting, and we see the window above his living room door opens to show, in a perfect little circle, the door to his attic into the schoolroom. I've always really loved that, because the set had to be designed with that shot in mind. So you can just imagine the previs that went into this film was probably very extensive. Dorian goes to hide the painting away, but before he does, we do get a sort of a proto-version of the scene from the book where Basil comes to visit Dorian. Again, its focus is way more on Sybil's death, and there is in no way any element of homoeroticism. So in this version, Basil actually doesn't even mention why he won't exhibit the painting. He just kind of leaves it very vague that there was something about the painting, but his admiration for Dorian is never mentioned. An addition to the film that I really enjoyed, when Basil visits, he comments on the little yellow book, and he tells Dorian, "I don't like these books that Harry has you reading." And Dorian says, "What would you have me read?" And Basil pulls out a book and gives it to him, and it's The Life of Buddha. Now, that's an interesting idea, adding in a wider philosophy. As if to say, even though the lines are retained where Basil wants him to pray to God for forgiveness, we do get a wider philosophy, that there are a lot of ways to get to the one path. You just need to not be on the path of radical hedonism. They keep with this actually throughout the whole film. Something I didn't mention earlier is that Basil's art studio is covered in Oriental and Eastern art. Another little bit of that incidental visual storytelling in the actors' blocking is that Lord Henry is actually looking through a viewfinder as he tells Dorian that he needs to get perspective on some things. And that's actually so subtle that until I started writing this video, I didn't even realize he did it. Now, you could say it's in your face if you're looking for it, but I never even noticed it. Now, I haven't talked too much about it since we started this video, but I just want to point out again the use of space, the depth that this film gets across. I mean, when Basil is in the house and Dorian's out in his garden, and we see columns flanking French doors, when Dorian's in front of the doors, and then within we see the staircase, Basil, a wall behind him, and another framed doorway with windows looking out into the street. It's a really interesting way of filming a shot because it gets across a tremendous point of depth. Again, the tile floor, which the leading lines showing us where to look. It's just a damn good composition. Dorian takes the painting into his schoolroom to be hidden. And when he comes in, we see a wide shot with all of his toys from his childhood. And notice the toys that are the most visual, the ones that are put in the forefront. It's a rocking horse and a smaller riding horse on a shelf. A horse sort of like a knight would ride. These are very oversized toys, too. I mean, Hurd Hatfield, as a grown man, could get on the rocking horse. It's huge. We also see a globe, and directly behind the globe, we see a wall with dozens of preserved butterflies. That's a great callback, and again, there's not really that much attention drawn to it. And as he walks in, he knocks over a tiny wooden statue of a knight on a horse. As he hides away his degradation and decides to embrace hedonism, he knocks over and finally does away with the idea of being the man Sybil thought he was. Then we get a great montage where the narrator explains that over the years, Both men and women who have been destroyed by Dorian's amorality will not even be in the room with him. They don't even want to be around him because his influence is so deadly on those who are around him. And yet people can't believe what they say about him because he is so handsome and he looks 20 years old. It also shows Dorian going in and looking at his painting a few times, which, again, I appreciate. And one of the things I love about Hurd Hatfield's subtlety in this performance is that he stands next to the painting looking away from it. He pulls off the sheet, and then he walks in front of the painting, looks down at the floor, and then slowly looks up at it. As if he doesn't want to look at it too quick because it's so shocking. He has to look at it very gradually from the feet up. Again, subtle, never do they really draw much attention to it, but I really love that element. We see that Gladys has returned, and we even hear her playing The Little Yellow Bird on piano, briefly, and we see that she is still head over heels for Dorian. Gladys goes to one of Dorian's parties, and she even tells Basil, you know what, Dorian's not asked me to marry him, so I'm just going to ask him myself. And there's this other guy, his name is David, he's played by Peter Lawford, and I don't like him. He is such an annoying character, and Gladys is clearly from a different time period. You know, this 20 years has clearly passed because she is, at least to some degree, a little bit of a suffragette. She immediately goes, well, if Dorian won't ask, I'll just ask him to marry me. You know, well, I mean, what's the difference? A man can ask a woman, why can't I ask him? I'm going to ask him. And she's using David, really. David's going to take her to the party, and he's like, you're not marrying Dorian, I won't have it. And she's like, David, you don't own me. And he's like, well, even if you don't marry me, I wouldn't let you marry him. Oh, gosh, he's so annoying. So they go to the party, and Dorian gives her this lovely necklace, and it's clear he actually does have feelings for her, but he avoids expressing those feelings. He won't give in to them. And she says, is this your way of saying you don't love me? And he's like, if that's how you want to take it. And so she starts to leave, and David is up at the top floor fiddling with the door to the attic. And there's a great piece of dialogue where David comes down, and he's like, I was just exploring your mansion, Dorian. What you keep locked up there? Secret treasures? And Dorian's like, no, that's where I keep the bodies of inquisitive house guests. I love that line. So David takes her home. And then we cut forward to the evening of Dorian's 39th birthday. Dorian is walking in the fog, and he passes Basil Hallward, and this is one of the few versions that keep this in. Most versions do not do this. Basil just comes in Dorian's house. But they do pass each other in the fog, and Dorian leads him to the house. And as we can see, over the last 20 years, Dorian has had installed glass panels on either side of his front door, and these images have Sir Tristan in them, as if memorializing that view, artistically memorializing that view that Sybil Vane had of him. As if, in some way in the back of his mind, it does still nag at him, and she still is kind of the love of his life. A lot of this dialogue happens pretty much as it does in the book. Basil and Dorian discuss how everybody is, so aghast at Dorian's behavior, and yet Dorian looks as young as he ever did. Hurd Hatfield, I will mention, although there's no makeup changes on him, his expressions do get across a definite change. In the first half of the movie, he plays innocent. In the second half, he is very cruel. I mean, he is a cruel man, and you can look at his face and tell this is a mean man. I also like that as Basil is talking to Dorian, Dorian is looking at collector's coins that he's putting in a collection. I don't know what you call it. Those things you put collectible coins in. It's as if, as they're talking about the people that Dorian has ruined, these are the people he's collecting. That is some delicious visual storytelling. And that one is way more subtle than most of the things. In fact, until I started really analyzing it, I didn't pick up on what exactly they were trying to get across with it, but I think it's friggin' brilliant. I do wish that Basil and Lord Henry, that their makeup changes were a little bit better. All they really did is put white in their hair. Citizen Kane had already come out at this point, and it wasn't like we didn't know how to do old people makeup. I mean, I know that's a lot of movie to wear makeup for, but Boris Karloff was willing to wear the Frankenstein makeup. Okay, I think you guys could have extended to some creases in your faces. So just like in the book, Basil says, to know who you really are, I would have to see your soul, but only God can do that. Which spurs Dorian to take him and show him the painting. And he pulls down the tarp and shows Basil the painting. And Basil is shocked in a subtle and underplayed performance. It doesn't go over the top. In fact, none of the performances in this film go over the top. It's thoroughly modern in its acting sensibility. He's looking over the painting. However, in this case, I think actually his reaction should have been a little bigger, considering what we end up seeing the painting looks like. There is another spectacular piece of dialogue where Basil says, "This is my painting. You told me you had it destroyed." And Dorian says, "No, I was wrong. It destroyed me." Bam! That's our first view of the painting in 20 years. I've already mentioned this, but the Old Man Dorian painting is a completely different painting, done by Ivan Lee Lorraine Albright. A beautifully macabre masterpiece. I honestly wouldn't mind having a big version of this blown up and hung on my wall. It's so beautiful. Now, I know it's horrifying too, and I'm sure audience of 1945 really found this to be a genuine moment of horror. In fact, I think most people watching it today would find it to be a genuine moment of horror. That being said, it's also just beautiful. A lot of this plays out exactly as it does in the book, with Basil telling Dorian, "The prayer of your pride was answered, the prayer of your repentance may be also answered. Pray with me, Dorian, it's not too late." But the one addition, as mentioned earlier, is that he mentions Gladys, which makes Dorian feel like a caged animal, and he comes in with the knife and stabs Basil to death. A great little shot here is how the silhouette of Dorian stabbing Basil Hallward is shown over the painting. Now, I'm sure some people would say that that was done because of censorship reasons. They didn't want to show a lot of blood. However, I think this works way better than if we saw Dorian stabbing Basil to death. Next, cut to another wham bam close-up on the painting's face. Then swing down to the hand where we see the painting's hands are now covered in blood and a knife has appeared in the painting. A nice little addition. There was no knife added to the painting in the book. However, I think this works a lot. Now, I've not commented much on the painting as I did in some of the other films we've reviewed. But the truth is, if you go and look at my channel, I made a whole video just looking at this painting and different elements of it that I thought were cool. One thing I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't mention, because it's so subtle, is that as Basil is praying, as he is trying to tell Dorian, repent, turn from your wicked ways, they frame the door behind Basil with a spotlight on the door so that in the cross frame, we see a cross illuminated, glowing in the background. You can't miss the thing. It's a beautifully subtle way of edging in that religious subtext. Basil is being Christ to Dorian, offering him the repentance. And of course, just like Christ died on the cross for the sins of someone else, so too, Basil dies as a sacrifice to keep Dorian's secret safe. And listen, I'm not reading too much into it, okay? The spotlight is on the lower half of the door on this shot of Basil, and then it's on the upper half of the door in another shot, as if they just wanted to make sure that it was in every shot with Basil. They had to move the lighting to get this effect. There's no way it was incidental. Dorian creates an alibi by leaving and then coming back in to get his servant to open the door for him, pretending that he just got home so that nobody knows that he was home at the time Basil was killed. Next, he gets Alan Campbell involved, blackmails him into destroying Basil's body, and all is pretty much going about the way it's represented in the book. Again, just with the addition of some great storytelling, and the fact that Dorian leads into the blackmail by quoting the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam. And it says, "I sent my soul through the invisible, some letter of that afterlife to spell. And by my soul returned to me and answered, I myself am heaven and hell." Beautiful, huh? Now, the Rubaiyat was actually very popular at this point in time, and so it's not really any wonder that they would decide to go with a reference like this that so many people were going to get. However, I also think there is something fairly Christian about that idea that I can understand touching a lot of people in America and in England at that time, as well as really fitting in line with the Dorian Gray story. Dorian later goes to a dinner with Gladys as everybody's talking about Basil's disappearance, and he asks Gladys to marry him. He just decides to go for it. We never really get a reason why he goes for that. Perhaps it's out of guilt, or perhaps he's just an ass, which is just as likely. I always really enjoyed how, in the background, we hear Lord Henry says, "This is the only marriage that I've ever approved of." He just can't go into any topic without expressing some opinion. They speak to the police about Basil's disappearance, and as Gladys and Dorian are leaving, the policeman says, "Hey, do you know Alan Campbell?" And Dorian's like, "Yeah, one time we were great friends. I haven't heard from him in years. Why do you ask this?" And the policeman says, "Well, it just so happens Alan Campbell turned up dead. He committed suicide." So that's just another thing to weigh heavy on Dorian's conscience. He drops Gladys off at home and decides to go back to the East End to get high, get drunk, buy some prostitutes, just forget about Alan Campbell. In fact, the narrator has a great line where he says, "There were other roads to forgetfulness than the one that Alan Campbell chose." There's a fantastic matte painting shot here. I plan to do a whole video about matte paintings at some point, so I won't dwell on this. I did a video before, but it got removed. A couple of people flagged it. It's a long story. Anyway, so Dorian goes there, and we see James Vane, who has aged about as gracefully as Dorian has, all things considered. He has come back to keep his promise to kill Sir Tristan. And we get Dorian talking to one of his former friends who he ruined. And another piece of great visual storytelling, this guy now does chalk drawings for pennies to help fund his terrible ruin. As Dorian leaves, he says, "Goodbye, Sir Tristan." James hears it, jumps up and runs to catch Dorian. And we see Dorian being held with his face completely in the shadows. It's a fantastic shot. And just like in the book, he tells James, "Oh, come on, look at me. I'm only 20. I couldn't have killed your sister." If there's one thing I did have to complain about, it's actually that James walks around with this little rope in his hand, saying he's going to kill Dorian, and even when he gets him against the wall, he just has this like little baby noose that he's tied around Dorian's neck. I just don't think that would probably strangle somebody unless you were really putting some oomph behind it, you know? So I did find that to be a little bit goofy. He lets Dorian go, and then Adrian asks him, "Why didn't you kill him?" He says, "Come on, that guy couldn't be the guy who killed my sister. He's too young." And he's like, "How old do you think he is?" "Well, maybe 20. Dorian Gray has looked 20 for the last 20 years. And James goes, "What did you say his name was?" And Adrian walks over and writes his name in chalk on the wall with a big flourish of music. It's a really dramatic scene. But gosh dang it, I just love it. It's so over the top, but there's just something perfect about it. Again, the rest more or less follows the book. James is killed in a hunting accident trying to kill Dorian. Dorian is paranoid and can't sleep all night worrying about his painting, worrying about James wanting to kill him. He sees James's body and refuses to identify it, so that James is now going to be buried in a nameless grave. Gladys comes to tell Dorian, "Hey, it's all okay. You're not dressed for dinner. You're going to be late." And he says, "I'll catch up with you. I love you." I just looks at her for a minute, and she starts to leave, and he says goodbye, and she goes, "Goodbye? Well, until 8 o'clock?" And he goes, "Yeah, until 8 o'clock." And he lets her leave. Dorian races home, and on the way he passes David, who has a suspicious look on his face. When David arrives, he tells Gladys and Harry that he broke into Dorian's house. He wanted to see what was in the attic, and now he realizes that he was a terrible ass, and that actually he realizes Dorian probably wasn't a bad guy after all, and everybody has the right to keep their secrets. And he tells them the only thing in the attic that was worth mentioning was a painting of a grotesque old man. Gladys actually deduces that this was the painting from Basil by asking, did it have a G signed under it? And she identifies it because of the cat with the glowing eyes. So again, I know that, I guess it was an important plot point, but still, I'm iffy on that cat thing. She also gets a letter that Dorian has left behind, telling her that he has to leave her to save her from the ruin that he brings with him everywhere he goes. And he says, I beg you not to try to convince me otherwise. Please just accept this. It is probably the only good thing I have ever done. Man, that gets me a little bit, because, again, this Dorian Gray was built up to have a redemption arc, and we want him to be redeemed. We really do. We see that underneath there was something good that was being layered under these layers of detestable behavior, and it's emphasized again and again and again through his dialogue, like when he talks to Sybil and he says, he's talking about the sadness of this piece of music that he plays all the time. And she says, why do you think the writer was so sad? And he said, maybe he felt his youth slipping away. And we constantly get reminders that Dorian realizes life is passing quickly, and he's trying to live a fuller life, and it is sad in a way. It makes him less of just a detestable, gross human being, and more of kind of a Greek tragedy. A really good guy who has this one flaw that unravels his whole life. And when Dorian gets there, he's hoping there will be some change in the painting. That maybe his one good deed might have shone through. And he pulls down the tarp off the painting, and when he looks at it, Dorian's face is filled with hope. It kind of sends chills up my spine. And the narrator says, yes, there was something there. Fighting through the loathsomeness, there was something, but it was definitely a change. And it was for the better. And Dorian decides, I'm going to go to the country and live a simple life, free from temptation, and I'll never do anything else again. I'll just give it all up. And the narrator says, but the painting would always be there to tempt his weakness. He knew he must destroy it and grow old as other men do. The narrator says that Dorian picks up the little statue of the knight in shining armor and places it back, not upright on the floor where it was, but elevates it to the table. He elevates it. He brings to light, this is who I really am, and this is who I will be, and who I will always be from now on. And so he decides to destroy the painting. He picks up the knife that killed the artist, and he walks towards the painting and stabs it. And then Dorian topples back, grasping his chest, and he falls to the ground off of the table. And right before the painting starts changing, we hear Dorian, as the uplifting music swells, Dorian says, pray, Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. Pray, Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. He knows he's dying. He knows this is his last chance. And just like Basil told him, just like the hand of redemption that reached out to him all those nights ago when he killed Basil Hallward, he seizes it and says, pray, Father, forgive me, for I have sinned through my fault, through my most grievous fault. And the painting begins to change, and the music is just soaring. It's amazing, sends chills up my spine. And there's a brilliant little dissolve, wavy, foggy effect that they use for the painting. And it's as if all of the painting's ruin is being absorbed into the knife, as if it's all draining out through the hole in the knife. For a 1945 effect of this caliber, there was a lot of thought put into how to make this look and get across an idea as if the degeneration was springing from the wound on Dorian without us seeing it, and it was eking into the wound in the painting. Harry, David, and Gladys walk in to see the degraded body of Dorian Gray on the floor, and the painting as beautiful as the day it was made. Lord Henry looks over the carnage of the body that he had helped destroy, and he says, heaven forgive me. It's probably the only version where Lord Henry has a genuine redemption at the end, realizing that all of his idle talk and demoralizing chatter about what people should do with their lives, that it wasn't just a joke, it was having real-life consequences. And I like that. It gives hope for every character in the film, by allowing us to believe perhaps Lord Henry changed and became a better man too. We close on the book, the Rubaiyat, once again open to that page with that beautiful poem relating directly to the story, and it's leaned up against the cat idol. And that is how we close out. I said when we opened this that this was the definitive version of Dorian Gray, and I will stand by that. There has never been a version this lavish, this beautiful, with this much thought put into every single shot, in the framing of every shot. The actors are brilliant. The narration, brilliant. The writing, brilliant. This film deserved all the praise it got at the time, and now it deserves way more praise than it gets. It's become almost forgotten among people who don't just love this story, but this is probably the best adaptation you're ever likely to get. Now, there are other versions I like equally as well for their entertainment value, but as far as getting across the morality of this story, and doing it in a way where the character is redeemed, I just find no equivalent to this particular version. Whew. I've wanted to talk about this film on my channel since I started this channel, and now that I've told you the secret of my soul, I feel as if something's gone out of me. But no, seriously, I hope that this inspires you, if you've not seen it, to go out and buy the movie. It's not overly expensive, and you can get it on Prime. So please check it out. It's just wonderful, and it's time well spent, I promise you. So thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you in the next one.